So speaking of losing power and everything, we've all had, right, the experience at some time or another in our lives, maybe even this past year, of having the power go out in our homes, right? And stumbling around in the dark, either looking for a candle or a flashlight or a breaker box. And in that darkness, we wander around, right? Maybe stubbing our toes on things that we walk past just unconsciously every day. And even though we walk past them unconsciously every day, once we're in the dark, we forget where they are. So I've done that. I've stubbed my toe on the sofa or on the coffee table, or just getting up out of bed in the middle of the night, and we bump into something. But that's our ignorance in the dark. So let's look at that word ignorance for a minute, and we're going to talk a little while about what the Buddha says about it. The word ignorance as we know it comes from around the year 1200 in the Common Era, and it's from the old French word which means a lack of wisdom or a lack of knowledge. And later on, it usually refers to literally ignoring something and remaining ignorant willfully. We've all heard that old saying, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise, right? People just say it, ignorance is bliss, because what they mean is, I don't want to know. Ignorance is bliss. And that line actually comes from a poem by Thomas Gray in 1742. But is ignorance bliss? In some cases it can be, right? For example, it's your birthday and your friends plan a surprise party for you. So you're ignorant of it, in the sense that you don't know about it. It's going to be a surprise. And then the surprise happens and you feel happy. You feel blissful that your friends planned this surprise party. If you had known about it, if someone had slipped, and we've all done this or had this happen to us, if someone had slipped and revealed that there was going to be a surprise party, it wouldn't be quite as happy, right? It wouldn't be quite as blissful, although it was very nice of them to plan that party. My birthday is December 19th, just so you know. Just saying. I'll act surprised, I promise. Now, maybe some of you can relate to this if you're parents, if you've had children, or if you've had a relative who's a young person living with you for a while or something, and your child goes away to college. And there's a lot of partying and a lot of drinking and all sorts of things that parents worry about, right? But they check in all the time and it all seems fine and you calm down. Then they get older, and over time, over dinner one night, a few years later, or when they're a lot older, and they're visiting for the holidays, for example, or something, and they tell you all about their college escapades. And you're glad you didn't know. Ignorance was bliss at that point, right? I'll tell you a story about our two youngest, Corinne and Jake. When they were in their teens, I think Jake was probably around 13 or so, and Corinne was about 15 or so, a couple of years difference. They went away to a summer camp called Omega Teen Camp. If you know Omega Institute in New York State, they ran a teen camp. They no longer have it, but they ran a teen camp. And we thought it was a pretty cool camp. And it was really, the kids had a good time. But they went to Omega Teen Camp. And so after the camping period was over, we went up to pick them up at camp. And on the way back in the car, they're sitting in the back seat and we're saying, so how was camp? Oh, camp was great. What kind of things did you do? Oh, I learned, and this is Omega Teen Camp. We learned how to do a Thai massage, and we learned all this really cool new agey kind of stuff. And then Jake says, yeah, and we did the fire walk. And I almost veered off the road. I said, you what? You did the fire walk? Do you know what the fire walk is? The fire walk is a thing where there are hot coals, a bed of hot coals, and it started, actually, the guy who really made it popular was a guy named Tony Robbins. But other people have done it too. And what you do is you go into this meditative state, and then you walk across the bed of hot coals, and your feet don't get burned and all this stuff. And they did the fire walk at the teen camp. I had no idea, nor did Lisa, that they were going to do a fire walk with my teenage kids. I'm glad I didn't know that ahead of time. My ignorance was bliss, but they did the fire walk and they came out okay. I would never have done it. I still won't do it. I think it's just crazy. But for us, ignorance in that case was bliss. And then there's another kind of ignorance. There's the kind that can lead to ourselves being hurt or others being hurt or worse. It's a kind of ignorance that we see displayed increasingly around the world, more and more, as people are suffering the effects of widespread poverty, as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It's a kind of ignorance that is willful, that chooses to look away from the problems that we face. It's a kind of ignorance that we saw on display this past couple of weeks during that trial, where a judge says, you can't call those people victims. That'll prejudice the case. That's ignorance. That's willful ignorance. And the people who support that are being willfully ignorant because they know that that's not true. It's a kind of ignorance that gave a jury the ability, from all the stuff that they heard and didn't hear that they should have heard, that gives a jury the ability to say, not guilty on all counts. It's a kind of ignorance that allows a 17-year-old, a minor, to be given or have someone buy him a gun illegally because he's underage, and his mother ignorantly driving him to another state so he can participate with his gun in a riot against protesters who are legally protesting. That's the kind of ignorance we're facing. There's a line in Charles Dickens' book, A Christmas Carol, when the ghost of Christmas Present is speaking to Scrooge just before he meets the third ghost, the ghost of Christmas Future. And the ghost opens his robes to reveal two small, poor, malnourished children sitting at his feet, clinging to him. You don't see this really in the movies. It's in the book. You have to read it. And Scrooge is surprised. And he's a little scared because the description of them in the book is that they were really, really skinny and malnourished and frightening to look at almost. And Scrooge asks the ghost of Christmas Present if these children were his. And the ghost replies, they are humanities. Says they are man's, but we'll say they are humanities' children. This boy is ignorance, he says, and this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree, but most of all, beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written, which is doom, unless the writing be erased. If the ignorance continues, we are doomed. That's what Dickens was saying. And they were as ignorant back in Dickens' day as they are today. But the Buddha here, when we talk about this third of the three poisons, ignorance, the Buddha isn't talking about that kind of ignorance. The ignorance referred to in Buddhism is again, the third and probably the worst of the three poisons. The Chinese characters for how ignorance is described are interesting. In Japanese, the Buddhist term for ignorance is mumio, M-U-M-Y-O, mumyo. And it consists of two Chinese characters. The first character, mu, M-U, means there is no, or it doesn't exist. And the second character, myo, means clear, bright, radiant. So when you put those characters together to form mumyo, it means there is no clarity, there is no radiance, there is no brightness. And it's a very descriptive way of explaining ignorance. When you are in that ignorant state that the Buddha is talking about, there's no light, there's no radiance, only darkness. The Buddha is saying to us that our life as unawakened, unenlightened beings is to live as if we're stumbling around in the dark. We don't know which way to turn. We run into all kinds of things. A life of ignorance is to have all kinds of things become obstacles in our life, like floundering around in the dark, as I said. We don't know which way to turn. We don't know which way to go. We go left, we go right, but every direction, it seems, is dark. And we cause ourselves and others all kinds of pain because we can't see where we're going. That's ignorance. The Tibetan Buddhist teacher Sogyal Rinpoche writes this. He says, we believe, or meaning all of us, we believe in a personal, unique, and separate identity. But if we dare to examine it, we find that this identity depends entirely on an endless collection of things to prop it up. Our name, our biography, he says, our partners, our family, home, job, friends, credit cards. It is on their fragile and transient support that we rely for our security. So when they're all taken away, will we have any idea of who we really are? Without our familiar props, he says, we are faced with just ourselves, a person we do not know, an unnerving stranger with whom we have been living all the time, but we never really wanted to meet. Isn't that why we've tried to fill every moment of time with noise and activity, however boring or trivial, to ensure that we're never left in silence with this stranger on our own? Now, some of us enjoy being alone. Some of us appreciate solitude. There's a difference between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is usually a choice. I like to be alone at times. Sometimes I really like to be alone, a lot. But we all need other people in our lives. But what he's saying here is that we depend so much on that in our culture. Let's watch TV all the time. Let's be on the internet all the time. Let's listen to music. Let's just live this noisy, loud life so that we don't have to think about who we really are. What is our purpose in life? What are we doing? And so this kind of ignorance is not bliss. We don't really know or understand who we are. At least the vast majority of people don't. And most of us who understand only a little, or only sometimes. We get glimpses. And we get those glimpses of this, but then we're pretty soon distracted. You know, we're talking about spiritual things, and then we're like that golden Labrador retriever we know, who's being a good boy. Oops, squirrel. You know. And it's this kind of ignorance that gives rise to the other two poisons that the Buddha talked about, that we spoke about the past few weeks, the poisons of greed and anger and all of their derivative poisons. But because we lack wisdom, we can't see things clearly. It leads to anger or greed, which in turn creates more ignorance and more greed and more anger. And we're caught in a vicious cycle of self-created suffering, that dukkha that I refer to all the time. And ignorance is not referring to education, like failing on a test or having a low IQ. You can be brilliantly smart and still ignorant in the sense that the Buddha is talking about. And in the same manner, you could have very little education and you could have true wisdom, the opposite of ignorance. In Buddhism and in so many other cultures and so many other traditions, there are numerous stories of small, poor little villagers living in a village somewhere with nothing except maybe a roof over their head or something, and they are much wiser than the wisest rich person around or the wisest politician around. I think we all know people like that. Maybe we have people like that in our lives. Ignorance is sometimes translated as delusion. All I have to say to you is probably the phrase alternative facts, right? Remember that? And so you immediately understand why ignorance can be poisonous. It blurs reality and it sets us up for causing harm, either accidentally or intentionally. And ignorance or delusion robs us of happiness because it isn't grounded in reality. So now maybe after all these weeks, you might be wondering, well, what are we supposed to do in order to handle these three poisons? Well, luckily, these toxins aren't anything new, and the Buddha had antidotes for them. According to the Buddha, the antidote for greed is generosity. And I think most of us here in this congregation, and most of the people we know, I think, know that. And we're very generous. We show that every year when we have our fundraiser, our auction. Or we show it when we do things like we did a few weeks ago when we contributed to, after the storm, we contributed to the organization that was helping seniors move out of their homes for a while they were repaired. And all of those acts of generosity are an antidote to greed. Anger, the Buddha says the antidote to anger is compassion. And again, this is another practice that we place a lot of emphasis on around here. Compassion doesn't mean that we approve necessarily of something a person has done or something we're okay with what they're going through. It means that we can understand. Compassion. We have passion for that. Maybe we've gone through the same thing or are going through the same thing. Maybe it's someone who has hurt us and our anger becomes compassion. We sit and we think, oh, wait, you know what? I've done the same thing. I've been in the same situation, and maybe I hurt someone as well. And so we have compassion for that person. And the antidote to ignorance is the cultivation of wisdom. And by wisdom, I don't mean that accumulation of knowledge. There's nothing wrong with accumulating knowledge, but it's how you use that knowledge. Wisdom is different than knowledge because it requires that we keep our hearts and our minds open and be willing to grow, to be self-aware, and to correct course when we're going down the wrong path. Generosity, compassion, and wisdom. Those are the antidotes for greed, anger, and ignorance that the Buddha talked about. And especially now, I'd like to suggest that embracing them is the work that we have to do together for the healing of ourselves and for the healing of our country and for the healing of the world. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.